Mr. Speaker, I agree with President Trump. Together we can break decades of political stalemate and choose greatness over gridlock. We can work together for the common good, to improve our outdated infrastructure, to protect American workers, to provide a check against the high cost of health care and prescription drugs, to secure our borders, and yes, to fix our broken immigration system. As a nation, we have a right to secure our borders. As President Trump stated, tolerance for illegal immigration is not compassionate, it is cruel. Smugglers use migrant women and children to exploit our laws and to gain access to our country. Congress must act to address these issues that have plagued our country for far too long, because it is clear that America is stronger when we work together. And we saw incredible moments of unity last night. One that stands out for me is when Republicans and Democrats in this chamber sang happy birthday to Holocaust survivor Judah Semet. Mr. Semet narrowly avoided the mass killing at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh last night. He turned 81 years old. Mr. Speaker, I've witnessed many State of the Union addresses, but that is a moment I will truly never forget. The President and First Lady had many distinguished guests in addition to Mr. Semet, including another Pennsylvania resident, Pittsburgh police officer Timothy Matson. Officer Matson raced into the Tree of Life Synagogue and was shot 7 times as he chased down the shooter. Officer Matson has undergone 12 surgeries, and I understand he has more in the future, but he made the trip to Washington to be in the gallery last night. We are proud of the bravery and heroism of both Officer Matson and Mr. Semet. It was an honor to have them in the chamber last night. The President and First Lady also welcomed a World War II and D-Day veteran, the first man to step on the moon, a childhood cancer survivor, former prisoners who, thanks to criminal justice reform, have their lives back, and many other special guests. The State of the Union is both a time to reflect and look to the future, and this administration has achieved record-setting accomplishments. The policies being put forth truly are lifting up all Americans and setting a foundation to build a safe, strong, and a proud America. We have worked to combat the opioid crisis. We have provided relief from burdensome regulations. We've given our military the resources it needs to be successful. And we can continue to work towards solving the very serious problems facing this nation. Now, I thank President Trump for outlining his vision for the path forward, and I look forward to working together to overcome some of our greatest challenges. I know we can do it because it's the American way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night in this very chamber, we heard a lot about what has made America the strong country it is, the ideals, the founding ideals, and the strength with which, when the people are able to put their will, their way behind it.
Good morning, folks. As you can see, we're having a couple of technical difficulties.
What the President outlined
we have a tech person en route, and we should get started within 5 minutes.
The situation at our border. Now, interestingly, polls taken last night by CBS and CNN, not the bastions of conservatism or the supporters of President Trump that you would expect, but both of these polls, the people's voice across this country, added up to 76% of somewhat support or strongly support what the measures the President had talked about in securing our border. We can get into the semantics. You wanted to call it a wall, call it a fence, whatever it is. A strong fence makes for good neighbors, old cowboy saying. The President laid out a plan that he wants to work with this Congress to get to a resolution on that. Not an executive order, but in the time since we came up with this temporary solution here for 3 weeks, the negotiations from that side of the aisle have been zip. Is that what people see as this chamber, this process is supposed to be? No. They want us at the table coming up with solutions. the president has reached out with the olive branch saying, we'll give you 3 more weeks on this. Let's get the government reopened and get a solution on this. Instead, gridlock. What the president talked about was greatness instead of gridlock. That's what this nation is about. That's what we need. Instead, we hear around here that the crisis isn't something that at our border, isn't something with the immigration problem we have. We hear about climate change, climate change, climate change. A manufactured problem, a manufactured crisis. Indeed, the United States is leading the way of all the westernized countries, of all the industrialized countries, of lowering its CO2 numbers, leading the way by things we're already doing and innovating. Yet that's the first thing that the religion of climate change can be tapped around here to stop the progress we have when we can make more progress by being a thriving, strong economy. The crisis isn't that. It would be much more so our crushing national debt and our border situation. If we don't provide for our own security as a nation, then we don't really have much. So let's solve these issues. As we prosper, as we do better, we can even improve more on doing things environmentally more strongly. I come from Northern California, where the climate has been pretty tough with the drought. The climate is pretty tough when our forests burn around us and amongst us, like in the town of Paradise, town of Redding, and other areas of the district that are so negatively affected by that. Crisis doesn't lie in the religion of climate change. The crisis lies of us not doing everything we can to protect our citizens at the border from the crushing national debt and from the threatened export of our jobs, that we should be employing our own people here. So, Mr. Speaker, there's room for a lot of optimism. We heard that message of optimism last night from the president, again, right in this chamber, when he mentioned our great heroes from World War II that were here last night, and one of the people they liberated from those camps where the Germans held the Jewish people and executed so many of them and abused so many more. What a great story of optimism and what America is about, liberating and preserving freedom in this country and around the world. And one of the highlights of my time here in this U.S. House of Representatives, to see those people come together so many years later and celebrating what is great about America and how it exports that freedom and opportunity to the rest of the world. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the Chair declares the House in recess until noon today.
All right, everyone. Appreciate your patience. We have a technician on the way to turn off the floor, as interesting as that is. But why don't we get started, and we should be distraction-free momentarily. I just want to welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Mike Darner, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. On behalf of our caucus co-chairs, Representative Mark Pocan and Representative Pramila Jayapal, as well as CPC members Ocasio Cortez and Schakowsky, who helped plan this briefing, we're excited to welcome you to today's briefing on the economic and moral case for increasing the level of taxation on some of the wealthiest individuals in our society. Today's discussion is the first of a series of briefings the Progressive Caucus plans on hosting this Congress on some of the bold, transformative, and wildly popular ideas that underpin our progressive agenda. One quick programming note, we expect to be joined by Representatives Ocasio Cortez and Schakowsky sometime during this hour. When they arrive, our speakers will yield to them so they can make some brief remarks, and then we'll pick the discussion right back up after that. At this time, I'm going to introduce our fabulous panel, four amazing experts who have worked on some of these cutting-edge issues related to taxation and income inequality throughout their careers. Following presentations from our panelists, we'll open up the conversation for questions from the audience. So first, I would like to introduce Thea Lee. She is the president of the Economic and Policy Institute. She joined EPI on November 1st, 2017. Thea is committed to EPI's mission of building an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy few. She's extending EPI's research through expanding engagement with states and with progressive organizers. She spent her career advocating on behalf of working families in the national policy debates on issues such as wage inequality, workers' rights, and fair trade. She's the co-author of the Field Guide to the Global Economy and has authored numerous publications on the North American Free Trade Agreement, the impact of international trade on U.S. wage inequality, and the domestic steel and textile industries. Next, we have Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's the director of the Center of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's a world-renowned economics professor, best-selling author, innovative educator, and global leader in sustainable development. He's widely recognized for championing bold and effective strategies to address complex challenges, including debt crises, hyperinflation, the transition from central planning to market economies, the control of AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, and the escape from extreme poverty. He's the director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and an SDG advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Next, we have Eileen Applebaum, who is our co-director at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. She's also a fellow at Rutgers University's Center for Women and Work and a visiting professor at the University of Leicester in the UK. Prior to joining CEPR, she held positions as a distinguished professor and director of the Center for Women and Work at Rutgers University and as a professor of economics at Temple University. And then our final panelist, Steve Wamhoff, Director of Federal Tax Policy at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Steve is ITEP's Director of Federal Tax Policy. In this role, he's responsible for setting the organization's federal research and policy agenda. He's authored numerous reports and analyses of federal tax policy. He spent more than 2 years as a senior tax policy analyst for CPC founder Senator Bernie Sanders, and as a member of the Senator's Budget Committee staff. Thank you so much to this distinguished panel for joining us, and I will turn it over to Thea for her remarks.
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today on this amazing panel to talk about marginal tax rates. And I'd like to thank the Progressive Caucus and Keen and Mike for pulling us all together. I'm going to provide an overview of the rationale for raising the marginal tax rate, and my co-panelists are going to flesh out the details on history, cross-country comparisons, and the importance of closing loopholes. But first, I wanted to start by grounding ourselves in this moment in history. We have experienced 4 decades of extraordinary growth in wealth and income inequality, with the accompanying real wage stagnation for most working families. I fear that we have all grown hardened to this reality, and that now we need to remind ourselves constantly how deeply unacceptable this outcome should be to everyone. You've all heard the story about the frog and the pot of water. You put a frog in the pot of water and you slowly turn up the heat, and it takes a while for the frog to realize that it's actually being boiled. And I think what we have here today is an enormous vat of frog soup. And we need to toss out the frog soup and start fresh, because this policy debate is so important to our future and to everything that we want to accomplish as progressives over the next couple of years. But if we look at the last 4 decades, economic output grew, technological innovation happened, the world became more connected through trade, investment, through technology, through communications, but working families did not get their fair share of that wealth. They played by the rules, they got more education and skills, they worked harder and longer, and they sent more household members into the workforce. And yet, over the last 40 years, the total labor share of market-based income in the United States for the bottom 90% of households fell from 58% in 1979 to 47% in 2015. And if, just to take a big number, if the 79 share had held constant, if they had just held on to the same share of income that they had in 1979, they would have more than $1.35 trillion in their pockets. That's about $10,800 more per household. So that is the context for today's conversation, which is a looting of workers that has happened over the course of decades. Economists sometimes like to justify policy changes that have a disparate impact on different groups by invoking the concept of Pareto optimality. Some of you can go back to your Econ 101 class and you remember that. And so what they say is that if a policy change, and often this is used for trade liberalization, will bring overall net national gains, but it might, create winners here and losers over there, then the concept economists use is that it would be possible, it would be theoretically possible to tax the winners and compensate the losers, and everybody would be better off. You all remember hearing that sometime? But the story of the last 4 decades is actually the opposite of that. Rich people and corporate elites rigged the rules of the U.S. economy in so many different ways to undermine worker power. We implemented the wrong kind of globalization and trade policy, encouraging outsourcing over exports. There were attacks on unions, erosion of the minimum wage, and an austerity budget and macroeconomic policies. All of these things were deliberate policy changes that redistributed income and power from working people to the very, very richest in our economy. And instead of taxing the winners to compensate the losers, we did the opposite. We gutted our tax code to cut tax rates for the wealthy and corporations, doubling down last year with the TCJA, and blowing a huge hole, a $2 trillion hole in our budget, to go in the exact wrong direction. So that's the moment that we live in today. And we look back at the most prosperous period in U.S. history. We know that marginal tax rates were in the 90s for some of the most prosperous years in American history, at 91% in 1966. And of course, remember that we're talking about marginal tax rates, not total tax rates. So we're talking about taxing the income above a certain threshold at that high rate, not taxing your entire income. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. So what I wanted to talk about, the 3 goals of tax policy: raising revenues, changing behavior, and achieving fairness. And each one of these are important, but raising revenue, I think, in 2019 is one of the most important, partly because of the TCJA, because of the tax bill from last year, but also because of the burning needs that we see and feel and know exist in today's economy. Infrastructure, a Green New Deal, training, skills, education, and so on. We have so many ways in which we need to and can use tax revenue that it's important that we use every single tool at our disposal. We want to change behavior in desired ways. We want to disincentivize excessive corporate pay. And we want to make sure that people are getting the right signals from the tax code in terms of the kinds of policies that we're looking for. And we want to achieve fairness. And with that, let me pause and welcome our newest speaker. Thank you.
Thank Thank you all so much for coming here today, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for coming and being a part of this moment. I think what is so exciting about this briefing, but also what I hope to be the first of, what I hope this is the first of many more to come, is that I think what we're doing, especially as a progressive movement, is changing not just what our goals are, but how we're getting there. And when we talk about inside, outside organizing, a major part of building support for policies is education, and educating the public as to why we are taking the positions and stances that we're taking. I think for a very long time, we kind of abdicated that responsibility a little bit, and we allowed, we allowed just the right to characterize and explain our proposals for us. And instead of us shying away and saying, oh, a marginal tax is too complicated for the American public to understand, I think we respect our constituencies. We respect the intellect of the public enough to trust them to interpret what we have to say and to make our case. And what we found is that it's been enormously successful. When I first brought up the notion of marginal tax rates as high as 70% for income earners above $10 million, people thought that it was going to be this very scandalous moment. And just a few short weeks later, what we find is that 60% of the American public agrees, including a majority of Republican voters as well. And so I kind of famously said on Twitter, all your base belong to us, because I do believe that it is through fighting for working class issues while educating the public on the intersectionality of those issues that we can really win back a very wide base. People often say that that my district, they'll try to dismiss it as overly Democrat, it's a heavily blue district, what works, and everyone says Brooklyn, and I'm like, I don't represent Brooklyn, it's the Bronx. But they'll say, what works there doesn't work in the rest of the country. And what a lot of people fail to understand is that my district is actually quite diverse, not just racially, but geographically, income-wise, and in the types of communities that are there. There are some communities in my district that look like the middle of Ohio. And there are pockets of my community that voted for President Trump. And instead of turning away from those communities, I leaned into them, and we won a decent amount of them as well. And so I think that this is an effective message. I think that it's a message that we can educate the public on, and that we see taxes not as just this boogeyman negative association that the right tries to explain for us, but that it's a tool. It's a tool. And for a very long time, taxes in our history, in our economic history, taxes weren't a burden on working and middle class Americans. They were largely a tool used to mitigate inequality and raise funds, particularly on the municipal and local level. And so I think that when we talk about that, one of the best ways that we can imbue hope in the public is not just talking about the future that we envision, but the past that we're drawing on. And to say we can do it because we've done it before and we can do it again. And when we last did it, we experienced some of the greatest rates of people ascending into the middle class, people lifting themselves out of poverty. But the last time we did it, we left people of color behind. We redlined around African American communities. We granted generational wealth through the use of home loans strictly to white communities. And one of the biggest sources of the intergenerational racial wealth gap is homeownership. And so as we start digging into these issues, I hope that this is part of a much longer conversation where through an economic agenda, we can fight for social justice. They are not different things. They are not a choice. They are the same thing. And I'm just so grateful for our panelists to be here to help start that process of education on our economic options and our economic history. So thank you all so much. I'm sorry to be popping in and out. I'm playing hooky on an oversight meeting to come here, so I'm going to hop right back in. But thank you all again.
Well, thank you to Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez for her amazing leadership and her voice and the clarity with which she has raised this issue and the bravery that we have broken through decades of kind of too timid, defensive, apologetic discussion about taxes. And as Alexandria, not really on first name basis, but as Alexandria said, that taxes are not a burden. It's a very kind of, it's an obvious common sense thing that there are a lot of things that we can't fund as individuals, as individual businesses. There are things that we don't do on our own, infrastructure, skills, climate change. Those are things we cannot do by spending money as individuals, but the government can do. And we need to pay taxes, and we need to figure out how that tax base can be achieved in a way that is equitable and efficient. And so some of the things that we were talking about, and I know my colleagues are going to talk more about it, so I'm going to jump past it, but if you talk about those three things, raising revenues, changing behavior in desired ways, and achieving fairness, raising marginal tax rates by substantial amounts achieves all three of those goals. There are definitely challenges, and these are some of the things I'm going to put out there, because as we get into this debate in a more substantive way, we need to be honest and we need to sort of make sure that we have all of our options open to us as we review the best possible way of going forward. The first one is avoiding unintended consequences. This is something people talk about a lot. You don't want to stifle growth or job creation or disincentivize work effort by high tax rates. But I think there's actually a lot of research, and I know Eileen is going to talk about that some, about the extent to which our tax rates are so low compared to historic rates and to other countries that we are not really in danger of doing many of those things. The second thing is addressing interaction with other taxes and measures. So trying to figure out how the federal tax rate fits with state property, corporate tax rates, payroll taxes, and so on. And that's an important consideration. So we just need to figure out how all those taxes work together and make sure that they're not at cross purposes. The third thing is pretty important, which is limiting evasion and avoidance. And I'm sort of going to use those two things a little bit differently. Avoidance might be illegal ways of avoiding the taxes that you legally owe, and evasion might be using legal loopholes to pay less taxes. And I think both of those things are significant, and that's why we need to pay a lot of attention, and I think Steve is going to talk more about that in his presentation, that if you don't close a lot of loopholes, then only honest people or people with lazy lawyers will pay taxes. And that actually undermines all the things that we want to accomplish, revenue and fairness in particular, and behavioral changes, because you're actually encouraging a lot of energy and resources to go into tax evasion, which is inefficient and stupid, and then you are rewarding the worst people and not the best people. So those are important issues that we do need to take into account as we go forward. The other big question, and I think it goes a little bit to, well, the illegal issue of tax avoidance is also super important, because a lot of people do not pay the taxes that they owe, naming no names. But I think we've seen actually a lot of evidence that increasing the budget of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, yields a tremendous payoff in terms of tax collection. So that's one easy thing that Democrats and Republicans ought to be able to agree to do, that we should use more resources to enforce the taxes that are on the books so that people don't get off scot-free when they break the law. But what mix of policies best achieves these goals? And I'm going to let my colleagues talk more about some of these, but raising the marginal income tax, as I said, is number one, is an obvious and optimal starting point. We also need to figure out if we're going to close the gap between how we tax capital income and labor income. This seems like it's creating incentives for people to shove their income into capital, like the hedge fund managers and so on, as opposed to other things. That's inefficient and it loses a lot of money. And then also, do we need wealth tax in addition to income tax? Probably we do. Estate taxes as a way of one-time grabbing a big chunk of wealth that's there and closing a lot of loopholes so that we broaden the base and that we are being as efficient as possible. But as Alexandria Ocasio Cortez said, a big chunk of our goals and our work over the next couple of years is building the political will and the mass support and the education to accomplish these goals. And some of the other kinds of things that we ought to be thinking about is in terms of the behavioral changes. Are there ways in which we can tie the tax code to behavioral changes, to other things, so that you incentivize people at both the top and the bottom to change their behavior. And I know the Institute for Policy Studies has a proposal to tie the top marginal tax rate to a multiple of the minimum wage, so that people at the top are invested in raising the minimum wage, also to keep their top rate lower. And then also another proposal that's been floated, which is important, is to tie the corporate tax rate to the ratio of CEO to worker pay, so that corporations would realize that they actually had an incentive to raise their worker pay in order to pay a different tax, a corporate tax rate. So those are all so important, and I'm so delighted to be here with all of you today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and to have your questions. So thank you, and please welcome Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you very much. I'm really delighted with this discussion and how our political discussion is changing very rapidly, because as Alexandria just noted a couple of minutes ago, for 25, 30, 35 years, we've not been allowed to talk about taxes at all. Taxes as necessary for revenues, taxes, as Thea Lee just explained, as a tool to shift behavior from bad things or away from bad things towards good things, and taxes as a way to ensure that we have a fair society. The United States has become more and more unfair, and the United States has become more and more bereft of basic public goods and services over this period. We're not taking care of ourselves, and we are falling apart compared to other countries where this right-wing libertarian mantra that somehow captured the politics in this country did not prevail elsewhere, so that there's a kind of sanity in public policy. We can actually compare what's happening elsewhere, and it's not just that we're not living up to our potential. We're falling farther and farther behind what normal countries all over the place are achieving. Now, I was going to show you a great PowerPoint presentation demonstrating this, so you're going to have to look at me as I show you graphs, because I can't quite show you the slides, but I'm going to try in just one way, if I could. I don't know whether you'll be able to see it, but basically I'm going to show you a lot of comparisons on my computer screen of the U.S. with others, but you won't see anything except maybe just a red line towards the extreme. That's us. Okay? We're on the extreme bad side of almost everything right now compared to other high-income countries. And the main difference is those countries view taxation as a normal tool to pay the bills, as a normal tool for better behavior, as a normal tool for a fair society. Whereas we're told, no, you can't touch that. And we find ourselves falling farther and farther behind on the basics of what a decent society can accomplish with all the know-how and technology that we have. So let me show you, if I can. I'll describe it all, so I apologize. That's a picture, okay? It has the revenues as a share of national income for a lot of high-income countries. If you can see, there's a red line there towards the lowest end on the right. That's the United States. We don't collect tax revenues as a share of national income anywhere close to what Canada or Europe collects. So they are able to provide more services and end up with a fairer society at the same time, both things accomplished. So we're collecting something like 30% of our national income in government revenues. Canada, something like 38%. It varies year to year. The Scandinavian countries, 45% and above. What do you get out of that? You get free tuition, you get health care for all, you get paid leave, you get all of the social benefits, which, of course, we utterly lack in this country, except the rich who pay for themselves and the poor who suffer as a result. If you look at the top tax rates, not just the collections of revenue as a share of income, but the rates, we're way down on the list. So the idea, oh, you can't go beyond our 36%. Well, all over the world it's being done in countries of tremendous prosperity, tremendous success, our neighbors, the Northern European high-flying nations as well. So just another one, always the U.S. red bar. We're at the near the end of the income, the end of the distribution. In other words, what is claimed to be impossible is not only possible, hey, it's being done everywhere except here. Then, as Alexandria just said, we used to do it. So you can actually look back as well in order to look forward. So I think everybody knows this famous graph of our top marginal tax rate. It came way, way down. What did we get for it? Not a lot of good. That's the problem, because the high tax period was the fast growth equal period. And the taxes have declined. We have had chronic budget shortfalls, a big run-up of our public debt, which is your burden for the future, I'm sorry to say. That's on you, because that's what these nasty policies provoked, and the absence of any building of infrastructure for the last 30 years or almost any other public good. So if you see everything broken down, the roads broken down, the highways broken down, the bridges broken down. I know when I arrive at an American airport from international travel, which I'm doing all the time, you know you've arrived because the escalators don't work, the elevators don't work, nothing works. That's because we haven't invested for a full generation, because we took away the tax means to do so. This is another graph, now even harder to see. There's a tiny little red bar here. This is what countries give in benefits to families. We don't do that here compared to the other high-income countries. We're the tiny little red bar at the end because we don't have the tax revenues. This is what's called public spending on active labor market policies like training and job matching. Oh, where are we? Oh, that would be the last country in the list. It's not possible to do, except that 25 countries are doing it. So if we open our eyes to what is happening elsewhere, we learn something. This is an interesting one. Here we're the top. This is private spending on college tuition, because the other countries have public spending on college tuition. So we're the most extreme. Again, the amount that you have to put out privately for college is the highest, whereas in other countries with the adequate tax revenues, well, that becomes part of the public goods. This is an interesting one. Everybody knows the Gini coefficient, the measure of household inequality of income. Where would the United States be compared to the other high-income countries? We're in the worst position. We have the most inequality of any high-income country because the tax system and the fiscal system overall, meaning not only how the taxes work, but what the revenues are used for health care for all, for education for all, for child care for all, for early childhood development, for every child, for family leave, for vacation time. We don't have those equalizing factors. So we have the most inequality of all the countries. This is a grim one. This is life expectancy at birth. The United States is now falling. I don't know what rank we'll have right now, but we've been around 35th to 40th in the world now in life expectancy at birth. Other countries have many years more of life expectancy. And do you know that in this country, life expectancy has declined 3 years in a row, almost unheard of in peacetime, in a rich country with technological improvements unimaginable, but it's happening on the bottom half of the income distribution. It's happening because people can't get basic services. It's happening because of desperation. And so this is another facet of this. This is killing people. Here we are, red line, if you can see it, all the way on the end. This is the OECD. That's the group of high-income countries, poverty definition. The United States is out of sight in poverty. The OECD defines poverty in a standardized way as being less than half of the median household income. And we have a very high proportion of households like that. This is one to make you unhappy. This is the happiness score, where Gallup International asks, are you happy? Well, we're not so happy. This is supposed to be the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, just turn it this way. I want to see it too.
Yeah. No, it's just so depressing. The countries, if you read the Wall Street Journal, you'd believe countries that are taxing themselves more must be desperate with unhappiness. But they are actually desperately happy, it turns out. Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Switzerland, Netherlands, those are the happiest countries in the world. And they have the higher tax rates because their societies are working in a normal way. Now, one more thing, and then I want to read a quote to you. This is confidence in government, very low in this country. Not surprising. Big debts, nothing's working, infrastructure's not getting built, inequality is rising, confidence is low. Okay, by the way, confidence used to be high, and it has fallen precipitously. Of course, too many wars, assassinations, scandals like Watergate, and then an era where government didn't do anything. So I want to close with an interesting observation by, interesting in quotation marks. If I can find this, hold on. Yeah, here it is. So if you read the Wall Street Journal, which I do to wake up in the morning because it's so outrageous every day, so it's a kind of my exercise running around the walls. One of the columnists recently, Holman Jenkins, on February 1, talked about Medicare for all, said impossible in this country. And then he goes through the arguments, and fair enough, he notes other countries do it. So he says, if it works for Scandinavia, it can work for us, is the clinching argument of almost every liberal op-ed you read. I'll put myself in that list. Wrong, according to the Nordics themselves. This is the part that never will be explained. I'm going to explain it to you, Holman. Scandinavian citizens exhibit an off-the-charts willingness to pay the necessary taxes because they have an off-the-charts confidence in government to deliver services. The U.S., and then it says, no less a body than the Nordic Council of Ministers calls such social trust the Nordic gold. The U.S., need it be added, is a country low and getting lower on social trust by every ranking, says Mr. Jenkins, which is no slur on the U.S. We are a big, rambunctious, diverse society. Yeah, super rich and a lot of suffering people, with other virtues, especially creativity. And then here's his conclusion. In the absence of trust, we know what will happen. Voters will license the ends but not the means. They want the care but not the taxes to pay for it, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Why is trust so low? Because we have been told by rich and powerful people for 30 years, nothing can be done. There's no solution. Now the argument, the final refuge of these scoundrels is, yes, we have to admit it works everywhere else, but it can't work here because trust is low. Well, you know what? It's not because of culture. Trust was high here in the past. It's low today. It is being recovered by the new political leadership we have, and we can build a fair and decent and prosperous society for everybody. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, one of the members, along with Alexandria, who is she here? No. Oh, okay. Who co-sponsored this this wonderful panel. You have before you the great experts, and we have a majority that can help to put into law some of the things that we're talking about and improve, maybe even make us happier. You never know. You know, we're certainly happy to be in the majority. And the American people are with us. The American people are with us. You know that 70% of Americans, including 54% of Republicans, support raising taxes on individuals earning more than $10 million. So the idea of fairness in taxation, despite what the president said yesterday, he was touting the, you know, the wonders of the tax scam, as we called it, and still call it, that made the rich richer and everyone else poorer. So you have the people that you need to hear, and people in the audiences as well. I wanted to just recognize Frank Clementi from Americans for Tax Fairness, who have done so much work. So we have the resources, the talent, the expertise that we need. Some of you may remember that actually, I want to remind you that Donald Trump, while he was campaigning, actually promised to repeal the carried interest loophole, restore fairness to the tax system, and obviously, once again, he lied. He didn't mean it, and the results are there. I just came from a hearing, and I'm going to go back to on global warming, the first in 6 years that we've had on that. And you know that the most recent tweet on the subject that the president had was that during the polar vortex, you know, bring us back, bring it back, global warming. We need you more than ever. You know, his total ignorance. Through much of my career, I've introduced the Fairness in Taxation Act, which would create new tax brackets. The highest I had the guts for was to go to 49%, which was the highest during the Reagan administration. You know, Alexandria went to 72%. Lo and behold, the American people think that's a pretty good idea for the richest among us. So we're going to work together. I look forward to that, to try and come up with another bill that does talk about how much we should be graduating our income tax and making the wealthy pay more. So I just want to thank all of you for coming. This is very important. It may be one of the most important issues that we're able to tackle while we have the majority. I really look forward to it. I wanted to say one thing about my legislation. Not only the carried interest loophole, but we want to make sure that capital gains preference is removed, that work is in equal balance with just, you know, coupon cutting, as we used to say. And so we want to make sure that in every way we balance the tax system so that all Americans are really paying their fair share. I do believe that that means that we're going to be able to do more from the safety net that's in tatters right now. And let's be clear, when the president talked about people not having, you know, fewer people on food stamps, He helped make that happen by throwing them off of food stamps. So we want to make sure that we have a strong safety net and the money to do it. Richest country in the world, at the richest moment in history, we can do all of this. Thank you for being here. Thank you, panelists. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm Eileen Applebaum from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. I'm really, really thrilled to be here today. It is an exciting moment, as both the Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez and Jan Schakowsky have said. It's a moment when we are finally able to talk about restoring fairness to our economy. I want to note that in recent weeks and in quick succession, we've had the idea from Representative Ocasio Cortez to raise the marginal tax rate. We've had a proposal from Senator Warren to have a wealth tax, and we've had a proposal from Senator Sanders to increase the estate tax on the richest 0.2% of households. So this is a really exciting time. And I want to emphasize that the point of this is not to soak the rich. The point of these proposals is to provide a basis for meaningful tax reform which can meet the twin goals of reducing extremes of income and wealth inequality and can protect American democracy from the predations of wealthy plutocrats. In the 34 years between 1946 and 1980, we had New Deal policies, progressive income taxes, progressive wealth taxes, and financial reform that regulated the accumulation of wealth. And in those years, we saw the wages of ordinary workers rise, we saw income inequality decline, and we saw a more fair distribution of wealth. Since 1980, we've seen tax cuts for the wealthy. We've seen the almost complete disappearance of the estate tax, and we have seen the rolling back of financial reforms. And the result of this has been a boom in top incomes of the richest Americans, and we've also seen the growth of the wealth of the wealthiest families. Together with the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision, this has brought money into politics. This has enabled corporations and the richest to protect their own interests, and it has enabled them to engage in philanthropy that suits their impulses and that enacts their preferences without any responsibility to the general public. So we get all kinds of policies from charter schools on down that reflect the particular preferences of particular wealthy people who don't pay taxes and are trying to fill gaps that exist because they don't pay taxes in ways that suit them and with no accountability to the rest of us. The recent tax proposals seek to redress this situation, and I think that the important proposal from Representative Ocasio-Cortez of a 70% marginal tax rate on incomes above $10 million is a policy that will begin to reverse the situation. So just to be clear, this is a proposal to tax the super rich. The just plain rich, the professors, the dentists, the doctors, the lawyers, the executives of small and medium-sized businesses, they are not going to be affected by her tax proposal because they are not making more than $10 million a year. And so the question is, what do economists think is going to happen, or what are they concerned about when they think about a tax on the super rich? And there are really three things that economists think about. The first is whether this is going to lead to a reduction in effort and entrepreneurial activity. Whether people making $10 million a year, making more than $10 million a year, are going to shirk on the job and reduce their effort and risk losing that job at $10 million a year. Because after all, if they don't put out the effort, they may not get to keep their job as CEO or whatever it is that's paying them all this money. So will they shirk? And I think you won't be surprised to learn that the studies that have been done do not find any evidence that they reduce their effort because you have a really high tax rate. We can't find evidence of that at all. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Being a baseball fan, I have to mention Manny Machado, who has clearly said he's looking for more money if you want more effort from him. But I don't really think that the U.S. economy is going to suffer much by whether Manny Machado hustles or doesn't hustle at third base. My Phillies team are, of course, debating whether they want to hire him over this particular issue. So shirking may not even be in his best interest. The second thing is that high-income people have the ability, as Thea has said, and as we're going to hear more in just a minute, they have the ability to dodge taxes. They're wealthy people, and they hire the highest priced tax and lawyers and accountants to help them reallocate and recharacterize their income. We've just heard about the capital gains, or we heard about the carried interest. But in addition to carried interest, there's also the fact that the capital gains tax is so much less than the income tax that very wealthy people can hire very high-priced lawyers to help them figure out how to make what looks like what is real income look like capital gains. They can do other kinds of things to avoid taxes. They can say, okay, give me less cash, but let me use the corporate jet whenever I want. They can disguise vacation, highly expensive vacation trips as business trips. They have a lot of tricks that they can play. And it's really, really important that all of these loopholes are closed. If we don't close the loopholes, then raising the marginal tax rate on the wealthy to 70% is really not going to do anything for fairness, for revenue, or anything else. And so there's no point of raising it if we cannot eliminate the loopholes. And the third consideration is the effect of high top tax rates on the effort that the wealthy put into bargaining for ever higher earnings. So you're making $10 million and you want that $11 million. At the current top tax rate, this will yield you about $630,000 extra dollars after taxes. If we had a 70% tax rate, this would yield you less than half that amount. And so the idea is, and we have some evidence of this, that it's not worth it to bargain so heavily for even higher and higher above that $10 million cutoff if more of it has to go to taxes and less of it stays with you. And so if they do forego bargaining for that last $1 million, then the businesses that employ them will have that $1 million, which they can use in any way that they think would be useful to the business, but certainly it's available to be used to raise to raise wages for ordinary workers. So the main argument against the high marginal tax rate, which we have seen does not really show up, but the main argument is that it will reduce entrepreneurial effort and it will reduce GDP. It will be bad for everybody. But what we have seen, and as Jeffrey Sachs has pointed out so clearly, is that there's no relationship between marginal tax rates and economic growth. We've had strong economic growth in the U.S. in periods of high marginal tax rates. We've had strong economic growth in periods of low marginal tax rate. And so this is just not an argument that can hold water, can stand up. We have seen, of course, the divergence between the wages of ordinary workers and productivity. We ask ourselves, where did that productivity growth go if it didn't go into the pockets of ordinary workers? And I think most people in this room know that the answer is it went into the pockets of the top 1%. And so we have a situation where if you go back to 1980, the bottom 50% of the income distribution had more than 20% of national income in aggregate. And the top 1% had about 13% of national income, or maybe more like 11% of national income. And if you look at it today, what you see is that the bottom 50% has gone from more than 20% of national income down to 13% of national income. And the richest 1% has gone from about 11% of national income to more than 20%. They've reversed, and the top 1% has more income in aggregate than the bottom 50%. Progressive transfers and taxes are effective even in our reduced situation in terms of both transfers and taxes, but they have been effective in raising the incomes of the bottom 50% of the income distribution. If we did better on that score, we would see a lot more. The last thing that I want to bring to your attention is the relationship between income inequality and wealth inequality. All this money going to the top 1%, what do we know about them? They can't possibly spend it all on themselves. And so they save, on average, over long periods of time, 20 to 25% of that income. The bottom 50%, struggling as they are, saves, on average, over long periods of time, 3% of their income. And in the recent period, with high mortgage debt, with high student loan debt, with high credit card debt, in aggregate, the savings of the bottom 50% have fallen to zero. So the richest people have 20 or 25% of these huge incomes, which they use to buy more assets. And so they get wealthier and wealthier. And unless we do something along the lines of what Representative Alexandria Ocasio Cortez has suggested, this situation is going to continue. We need to tax the highest income people at a much higher rate than we are now. It's time to reverse 40 years of tax breaks for the highest earners that have contributed to this upward redistribution of income. So thank you very much.
I'm Steve Wamhoff. I'm with the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. I want to thank the CPC for having me here. I appreciate the opportunity. And I also want to thank the CPC for bringing about this new focus on tax policy that we see in our public discourse today. Over the years that I've worked on this issue, it seemed that whenever I was out in public and I told people that I worked on tax policy, it almost seems that there was sort of like a dance move they would do to move away from me as quickly as possible when they found that out. So that's changing now. People actually want to talk about taxes, and I think the CPC members are a big part of that. So thank you for that. I think a lot of really important points have been made here today, and I want to focus on one particular part of the puzzle and a piece of how we make this all work, which involves closing special breaks and loopholes to make sure that high-income individuals and corporations actually pay whatever tax rates we enact. What I'm saying is not groundbreaking. I think it's actually pretty intuitive. I mean, we all know that before the new tax law was enacted, the corporate tax rate was 35%. Well, how many people in the room think that corporations actually paid 35% of their profits in taxes? We all know that very, very few, if any, corporations actually paid that much. And the same is true of high-income individuals, right? I mean, if we don't clear away the special breaks and loopholes that high-income individuals enjoy, it won't matter what rates we enact, what marginal income tax rates we enact. Everyone in this room already knows this, I think. And I know that a lot of the members of the CPC have really good proposals that would tackle this. I think it's worth, I do think it's worth emphasizing for the public and for the media that we have this part of it figured out. So I can give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. Just take one example. If we raise the top rate on the personal income tax, but we leave in place the big deduction for pass-through businesses that's part of the new tax law. Rich people will then just route more of their income through these pass-through businesses in order to keep their taxes low. To take another example, if we raise the top personal income tax rate on ordinary income, but we leave in place the special lower tax rate for capital gains and stock dividends, then, guess what? We're going to see more rich people using various schemes to make their income appear to be capital gains and dividends income so they can keep those lower rates. And these are parts of the personal income tax, but the same is true of the corporate income tax, right? So, if we raise the corporate income tax rate, but we leave, for example, we leave in place the brakes that provide the brakes for offshore corporate profits, then our corporations can engage in more accounting gimmicks to make their domestic profits look like offshore profits in order to keep their taxes low. Or even worse, they can actually move real investments and the jobs that go with them offshore. So we know how to solve these problems. We know how to avoid all of this. In fact, my organization just published a report yesterday on progressive revenue raising options that goes into a lot of detail about how to do this. That can be, you can find that at our website. That's itep.org, itep.org. And most of the options it describes basically would close special breaks and loopholes in the personal income tax, the corporate income tax, and the estate tax. It does include an option to create a wealth tax, which I think is also important. And as we know, we have a Senate proposal that is very similar to that. I can say a little bit more about these ideas, but I should say first, I know that this gets a little arcane and you might be a little tempted to fall asleep. But what I always say is that when it comes to tax policy, the details are complicated, but the narrative is simple. The U.S. needs to address inequality. The U.S. needs more revenue. And a big part of getting that revenue should be getting high-income households to pay their fair share. So everything I'm talking about really falls within that story. For example, I mentioned the special deduction for pass-through businesses that was enacted as part of the new tax law, the Trump tax cuts. These are businesses that pay the personal income tax, but not the corporate income tax. The profits go right to the owners, and they just pay the personal income tax on those profits. Proponents will often say that these are small businesses. That's nonsense. We know that the majority of this business income goes to the richest 1% of households, people who do not need a tax break. The same goes for the special rates for capital gains and stock dividends that I mentioned. The vast majority of the benefits of that goes to the richest 1%. The other example I mentioned involved the corporate income tax, and I know that sort of seemed like a little bit of a different issue, but it's really not, because at the end of the day, the corporate income tax really is paid by the wealthy for the most part. If you think about the way it works, it basically is paid by shareholders. If you cut the corporate income tax, corporations can retain more profits to pay to their larger dividends to their shareholders. So at the end of the day, it's hitting the shareholders. And we know that most shares are owned by the well-off. Not all, but most. Some folks in the Trump administration will try to convince you otherwise. They will claim that the corporate tax is really paid by workers. So if you cut the corporate tax, it helps workers. Their claim is that the corporate tax pushes corporate investment offshore, so that leaves workers in America with fewer job opportunities. This is a complicated debate, but my very simple answer to this is that corporate CEOs would not have lobbied you for many years to cut the corporate tax if they thought it was paid by their workers. Corporate CEOs answer to their shareholders, not to their workers, right? So they're only going to lobby you if it's in the shareholders' interest or in their own interest. They have a lot of shares and stock options and all of that. So it's clear to them that that tax hits the shareholders. What should Congress do about corporate taxes? Well, there's a lot of things they should do, but there's one very simple principle Congress should follow. Tax domestic profits and offshore profits the same way. When we tax offshore profits more lightly than domestic profits, then we shouldn't be surprised when our corporations engage in these schemes to make their domestic profits appear to be offshore profits, or to actually move real investments offshore and the jobs that go with them. And I can say a little bit more about that for anyone who's interested. But when I talk about this, a lot of people ask me, well, I don't know, don't rich people already pay a lot? Like, how much more should they pay? And I guess I have a couple answers to that question. First of all, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking the very richest Americans to pay more as a share of their income towards taxes than the rest of us. Because when you think about it, the investments that we make with tax dollars really have benefited the very wealthy more than anybody else. And we don't think about this very often, but if we use our tax dollars to build a highway, that benefits all of us. But if I'm Jeff Bezos and I'm shipping I have the company that's shipping all the products on those highways, I got to think I'm benefiting more. than a normal person, right? If we use our tax dollars for public education, create a productive workforce, that benefits everybody. But if I own the company that's hiring the productive workforce and using all those skills and I take home all the profits, I have to think I'm benefiting more than other people. And there's a lot of examples like this. I mean, you know, the way that our defense and security and the rule of law and protection of property creates a stable environment where a person could make a huge fortune here, which is not true in a lot of other countries. The government provides protection of property that obviously benefits those who have a lot of property more than it benefits those who have no property. And I guess the other thing I would say is our tax system is really not as progressive as people think it is. When you really look at it as a whole, it's really just barely progressive. So every year, my organization looks at the total tax system, putting together the entire federal, state, and local taxes. We do this around tax day. And we did this last year. We found that about 20% of the total income in the U.S. is going to the richest 1% of Americans. And the richest 1% of Americans paid about 23% of the total taxes. So the share of taxes paid by the very richest folks, it's slightly higher than the share of income they have, right? It's 23% versus 20%. I would call that, I would say, well, sure, our tax system is a little bit progressive. I wouldn't call that soaking the rich or anything like that. I would say, you know, it's just sort of barely progressive. And I think it's fair to say we can make it more progressive, and we know how to do that. And I can provide more details on a lot of these options for anyone who's interested in that. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to all of our panelists for the fabulous presentations. We've got about 15 minutes left, so we thought we would try and take a couple questions from the audience. And panelists, if we can answer in rapid-fire fashion as much as possible, that would be fabulous. If anybody has any questions, why don't we start right here with you, ma'am.
Thanks. Congresswoman Ocasio Cortez and President actually talked a little bit about education and sort of the fact that for decades Americans have been taught that taxes are bad. A lot of that is coming from Koch brothers funded organizations. Is it enough to have some charismatic people in Congress and a young generation that's just sort of fed up with how bad things are to move beyond where we are now? I mean, what else does this conversation need? Again, you know, there's been millions of dollars poured into this anti-tax rate on the other side.
Go ahead.
The money that's poured in is not only for public miseducation, but of course for direct campaign contributions. So this has been a pretty brutal exercise of the power of wealth, and it has become deeply debilitating in our society. We are running large budget deficits now, squeezing the most basic needs and services, unable to pay almost anything for what we need, and then told that any reform is unaffordable. But of course, that's on the gimmick by the rich that we can't pay more, when all of the evidence from our own history in the world is, of course they can, and I believe they're about to. And that's why they're reacting so much now, because they know that the game that they've played is coming to a close. Of course, they're going to have their friends who are going to protect them, but it just doesn't ring true when you hear some of these billionaires say, oh, how horrible this is. And I think that we're coming to the end of an era that has lasted almost 40 years now. But it has left us in a quite desperate situation to be able to manage. And so ironically, because we are richer than ever, we are more technologically capable than ever, but we have falling life expectancy. How much more dramatic does it have to be than that? We have come to the end of this particular story, and I think that these fantastic political leaders are making it happen.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in on that, because I think actually what's in our favor right now is that it is easier to change this whole trend and dynamic in a big way than it is a little way. So like some of the kind of pathetic, too small, tweaking around the edges, those arguments were sort of like, I guess it's not quite as bad as this. Like, if we could just raise your taxes a little tiny bit, please, you know, can we go from 37 to 39? You know, all the timidity didn't work and didn't have a message. And so that, you know, I think what Alexandria Ocasio Cortez and the incoming Congress have done is like opened up the conversation in a huge way. And I think we can win a big argument where we couldn't win the little one.
Yeah, I also think that the money that the Koch brothers and their ilk have spent had a big effect on Congress, had a big effect on our tax laws, but it's quite obvious that they did not persuade the American public, because as soon as somebody came out and said, hey, this is unfair, this is unreasonable, we need to go back to a situation where wages are rising, inequality is falling, and the way to get there, the way to start to get there, is with these big tax increases on the wealthiest people. This has resonated with the public. So if the Koch brothers thought they were persuading the public, they found out that they were sadly mistaken. And I think that is where all the pushback is coming now, because they really can see that the American public are up in arms about this and ready to follow a leadership that, as Thea has pointed out, is proposing bold changes.
Well, I would point out that the American public is actually always, I think, has always supported bold, progressive tax policies. I mean, if you actually look at polling going back several years, that's the case. I mean, I saw this headline, was it the other day? It was Democrats' tax plans show a profound shift in the public mood. There's actually not much of a shift. You look at the polling. So, you know, I was looking at this, like the Gallup has been asking people since 1992, do you think the wealthy pay too little in taxes? People have always said, yes, the wealthy pay too little. And some, you know, it's always above 55%, sometimes in the 60s. And they ask, you know, since 2004, they've been asking people, well, do you think corporations pay too little? People always say yes. It's always 60-something% or 70% of people always say yes. So I don't think there's a shift in the public mood. I guess what I think has changed is that, you know, we have members, like CPC members, who are, you know, articulating these proposals that, you know, people understand and relate to and support. And finally, those things are being taken seriously in the media and in the public debate.
Great. Why don't we do 3 more questions and we'll all answer them together? Yes.
So you spoke a lot about income taxes. I'm wondering what your opinion is on the payroll tax, because right now I think it's capped at $130,000, and that's only 83% of people earning income. So do you see a benefit for raising that to $250,000, $500,000, or just eliminating it altogether? I think CBO projected to be something like $2 trillion over 10 years if we eliminated the payroll tax.
Great. And you, ma'am.
So my question is, you all brought up a couple proposals, including like raising marginal tax rates, profit tax. So aside from the amount of tax revenue each is bringing in, what are the factors that are being used to evaluate which proposal or which combination of proposals?
Great. And then lastly, Jeff, you had a question?
I'll follow up later.
Okay, great. Okay, then we have one more. Go ahead.
So I know some of you touched on this in your remarks a little bit, but there seems to be a distinction between whether progressive taxes are needed to fund things and to make sure that, you know, wages grow. But it seems there's also an argument being made that billionaires are themselves some kind of policy failure, that it's there's a benefit just to not having them. I'm wondering if you could expand on whether that's the case, whereas even if we were seeing very strong wage growth over that last 30-year period, would you still favor some kind of tax system that tries to prevent people with multi-billion-dollar fortunes from essentially existing?
Okay. I'll start on the payroll tax. Yes, EPI has a proposal out to lift the payroll tax to cover at least 90% of earnings. And I think that is definitely needed in order to help expand Social Security. That's an important thing. That's for fairness and for other things. So that's a key one. How to evaluate the different proposals. I mean, I think we're going to, and maybe this goes to the next question too, which is looking at revenues, looking at fairness, looking at all the kind of unintended consequences, and making sure we're mitigating some of those. In terms of the question about I'd say the main reason we need progressive taxes is to fund things, because, as Jeffrey said, there are so many things that are burning needs for the United States. And this is, actually going back to globalization and competitiveness, that it is kind of ridiculous to think that the United States is going to be successful in the global economy if we don't fund education, skills, or infrastructure, if we don't do what we need to do in order to address some of our energy issues. Those are all absolutely important things that need to be done. But I think that Eileen's point was also important, which is that the extent to which excessive wealth distorts our political system and distorts the kind of political debate that we have, I think that's an important set of issues as well.
Just a quick comment that it's really important in policy to consider the overall package, not individual elements alone. And that's why initiatives like the People's Budget of the Congressional Progressive Caucus are so crucial. That is actually the only exercise in this city that looks at a full, comprehensive view of needs, of the policies for public goods, and how to raise revenues in a fair and efficient manner. So I think this is where I would like to see tremendous effort and attention paid to this year's People's Budget. Also, I know that that's the plan and that's the intention, because that can put together an overall framework that can help answer the questions. Tax policy, first of all, by itself should be efficient, not creating damage to the economy or to incentives. It should be just, as we have been talking about, and it should raise the revenues needed. But also, it should be viewed regarding the spending side, where the tremendous benefits of fairness come in when you have universal access to public services, a safe environment, care for children. That's where the fairness in the society shows up. So the revenues that are adequate to pay for that are crucial. Looking at the whole package is therefore crucial. I think on the question of billionaires, it is worth reflecting on the strange nature of our winner-take-all economy that is making people so fantastically rich at a scale unimaginable in the past. The number of billionaires and their wealth has soared in the last 20 years. According to the Forbes list for 2018, there were 585 U.S. billionaires with a combined net worth of $3 trillion. That's why when you look at the revenues that would be raised by the proposals of Senator Warren, for example, they're very substantial, because the amount of wealth in the hands of a few people is absolutely staggering. But what we see is, everywhere we turn, it's billionaires telling us what to do. So the whole society's become watching billionaires so that they can tell us our futures. They can tell us about our privacy. They can tell us about our policies. They can tell us about our taxation. Suddenly, we're just in the hands of billionaires everywhere. And this is absolutely a new circumstance. It is partly this design we've been talking about. Partly it's the accident of a winner-take-all digital global economy. But we have to put a limit to this. Otherwise, we really will be all working for a few people who will have all the wealth. And $3 trillion for 585 people, that's plenty. That is more than enough. That is a political accident. And it is a disaster happening with the number of billionaires that are going into politics, going into everything. We have one already who's a disaster, but more that are aspiring to this. Enough.
Yeah, I agree, of course, with everything that has been said. I just want to bring up the inheritance tax or the estate tax. When you talk about a policy failure, I think one of the really big dangers in this country is that we are creating a hereditary American aristocracy. This country was founded in opposition to the idea that there should be a hereditary aristocracy that rules people's lives. And as Jeff has just said, we are moving clearly in that direction. And we really need to take steps. It is a policy failure that this has been allowed to happen, and it's a policy failure that needs to be reversed. Senator Sanders has a proposal out that would begin to address that, would begin to address the exact families that Jeff is talking about. So in addition to the wealth tax, to the high marginal tax rates on income, on earnings, I think this inheritance tax is another very important point. We are in danger of seeing our democracy really in tatters. It's not just our social safety net that's at risk. It's our way of life that's at risk.
When it comes to the payroll tax, yes, absolutely. Raising the payroll tax makes sense. The growing wage inequality over the years means that more of the wages that are generated are above that cap. So, like you said, so a smaller portion, a smaller percentage of the wages is actually covered by the Social Security tax now than was the case in the past. So, you know, getting that percentage back up to something like 90%, like it was in the past, that's something that makes perfect sense. When it comes to like how do we evaluate which policies do we include in our recommendations, you know, when it comes to reforming the tax code and closing loopholes, like you could have 100 things on your list, of course. So we try to focus on the big ones, things that we know will raise a lot of revenue, like hundreds of billions of dollars usually. And also we focus on things that are progressive because we think that you know, the wealthy can afford to pay more. That's really the place that we start. And most of the things that I've been talking about and that you can see in our report really is mostly about the richest 1% or sometimes richest 5%. When it comes to the question of billionaires, and you know, I think you know for me what we're talking about is both about raising revenue and addressing inequality. And often, you know, the revenue can also, those things go together. Revenue can be used to make investments that help address inequality. I don't have really some sort of answer about exactly how much money is the amount of money a person can have or needs to have. But I will say, you know, what my boss says is that the wealth that, when you look at like billionaires, the kind of wealth they have, it's not like the wealth we have, right? Like, so for a normal person, if you have $400 or $4,000 or $400,000, that makes a big difference in your life in terms of what you can do and how you can live and how much stress you have in your life. When you have like hundreds of millions of dollars or billions, you know, whether you have 1 billion or 2 billion or 3 billion, that doesn't change your life. At that point, the money's a measure of your power, right? So it just, the starting place is we just need to start thinking about it that way, I think.
Let's give a round of applause for our fabulous panel one more time. I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank all the folks who are watching on Facebook, and we'll be in touch soon. Oh, and just want to flag, we will be posting Professor Sachs's PowerPoint and all of these supplementary materials on the Progressive Caucus's website, so you can check those out later. Thank you.
Hi.
I work with Josh.